All right, so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at the roots and early history of psychology. And this is a relatively short presentation. So what I'm going to do is instead of splitting it into thirds, I'm just going to split it into two presentations. So after the first set of slides, I'm going to stop and I'll take questions in the chat room about what we just covered. And after I've answered all those questions, I'll put up the second half for the next set of slides, another 5 slides, and I'll stop at the end of those slides and I'll, again, take questions in the chat room. So let's start at the beginning. How do you define psychology? If you think about it, the term psychology, if you look at it literally, means psyche, which is mind, and ology, which is the study of. Okay, so the literal definition of psychology is the study of the mind. The problem with that is, how do you study something that doesn't exist? What do I mean by that? Well, we all have a mind. I think you all know that you have a mind. The problem is you can't actually see the human mind because it's not a tangible thing. It's not a real thing. If you open up someone's head, if you open up their skull and look inside their skull, what you would see is the brain. So the big question, and one of the early questions that we've tried to answer in this field, is what is the relationship between the physical brain and the psychological component of that we call mind? So are they the same thing or are they different? One of the things that I learned in school when I was, taking all of those courses in psychology is the relationship between the brain and the mind is as follows. Mind is what brain does. So we're going to do a whole chapter on the human brain and the different functions of the different parts. But if you had to break it down into two broad categories, one of the things that the brain does is keep you alive biologically. And what I mean by that is everything that's happening from the neck down is being controlled by the brain. So if someone has a severe head injury, that could result in death because all of the internal organs from the heart and the lungs and all of the things that are sustaining life, if the brain gets damaged, they stop working because they're not getting instructions anymore. So if you think about it, the brain is like a master computer system that's controlling all of the other components inside your body. So we know that the brain is in charge of what's going on biologically, but we also know that we have a mind. We also know that we have consciousness. This is one of the more interesting areas in psychology to study, and it's called cognitive neuroscience. And it's trying to basically understand the relationship between the brain, the biology behind it, and the creation of what we call the mind or consciousness, our awareness of ourselves. So the working definition, the definition that we use most often in this field for psychology, is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So the question then is, what is the difference between a behavior and a mental process? So the answer is relatively simple. Think about a behavior. A behavior is something that somebody does, whether it's brushing their teeth or driving a car or talking or even sleeping. Those are all examples of behavior. And they're really important in psychology because if we only were trying to understand and study mental processes, the stuff the mind does, that would be almost impossible because you can't study something you can't see. How do you study a thought? How do you study an emotion? Those things are created by the mind. So behavior is what psychologists use that allows us to bridge the gap between speculation and objectivity. Okay? So here's how this is going to work. When we talk about the scientific component of psychology, the goal here is to try to answer questions about human behavior and try to answer questions about the human mental processes in a way that's objective and based on data. This is one of the chapters that most students don't find that interesting, but unfortunately, it's extremely important in psychology because the data is what makes the science. Science is about numbers. Numbers have to be generated from somewhere. They're generated through the data that psychologists get in doing experiments. So the scientific part of psychology is rooted in the scientific method, And we're going to talk more about that in the next chapter when we look at things like experiments and correlations. Then we go to behavior. And like I said, the key here is behavior is some kind of observable action, something that you can see. And if you could see it, then you can measure it. And if you can measure it, then you could study it scientifically. And then finally, the mental process part. This is the mind. This is the things that the brain does that we consider part of the mind. Things like our thoughts, things like our feelings, sensation. We're going to do a whole unit on sensation perception and dreams. So if you take all three of these together, the scientific study of behavior and mental processes and the attempt to understand those things, then what you have is the field that we now call psychology. Now, psychology didn't just appear, it evolved. And it really evolved out of two earlier attempts at understanding the human condition or understanding the human experience. One is called philosophy, and philosophy is an attempt at understanding the big questions like why am I here? All of the questions connected to human existence. And there's been a lot of philosophers, and unless you take a course in philosophy, excuse me, we don't have to know all of the philosophers, but there are two in particular that we need to talk about because of their different viewpoints on human existence and the human experience. The first was a guy by the name of Plato. And Plato, as an early philosopher, believed in something called nativism. And that's the idea that some knowledge, some information is inborn or innate. And what I mean by that is you are born according to this nativistic viewpoint with some components of who you are put in place genetically, put in place because of biology. All right. So in psychology, one of the big issues, one of the big sort of questions that we try to answer is known as nature versus nurture. So when we look at things like intelligence, are we intelligent because of our genes and biology? Meaning, if you're an intelligent individual, it's probably from this perspective due to the fact that you inherited genes from your parents and they were both smart. Or on the other side of this, we have another philosopher by the name of Aristotle who believed that we're born what he called like a tabula rasa, which basically means a blank slate. Think about a blank chalkboard or a blank, a white erase board, and that everything that we are is filled in by experience. So between these two guys, Plato and Aristotle, you have the foundation for a very important question in psychology. And that question is, what is it that shapes and influences us more? Is it nature, genes, and biology, or is it nurture, experience? Then we look at another important area that evolved into psychology, which is physiology, which is the study of biology and the study of the functions of that biology on living organisms. In psychology, we're going to focus primarily on the nervous system, and we're going to do a whole chapter on the nervous system. Basically, it's an attempt at understanding the relationship between the biology of the brain and how that biology influences and shapes behavior. And again, for a long time, there was a question mark as to what is that relationship between biology, the brain, and behavior, and biology, the brain, and personality. And one of the more interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later on, is one of the more interesting case studies involved a guy by the name of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a foreman on a railroad company in the late 1800s in Vermont. And there was an accident. And what happened in this accident was a metal rod about 3 foot long was basically shot up under Phineas Gage's eye and out through the top of his head. And he didn't die from that wound. But what happened was it changed his whole personality. We now know that the damage that his brain received because of that metal rod shooting through his head altered certain brain structures, which then altered his personality. So if you think of psychology as an evolving science, its parents were philosophy and physiology. Okay. So up until this point, psychology really wasn't considered a science. It was more speculation. And the reason that it wasn't considered a science was because it wasn't done scientifically. That all changed with a guy by the name of Wilhelm Wundt in a town called Leipzig, Germany. He is considered the father of scientific psychology, and the reason is he's the one that really thought of trying to understand psychological phenomena in a laboratory. According to Wundt, if you're going to do science, you have to do it in the environment that's conducive to science, which is a laboratory. So Wundt established a school called structuralism. And what I mean by that is he developed an approach at understanding scientific phenomena that he called structuralism. And this is considered, in a lot of ways, the first school of scientific thought in psychology. And again, this came about in 1879. Wundt used a technique called introspection, where he asked people to describe what they were thinking, what they were feeling, what they were seeing, what they were sensing. And this description he then called the technique of introspection.